Welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, October 11th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about James Tallarico in the Texas Senate race in 2026 as he announces that he raises $6 million in the first 3 weeks of his campaign. Colin Allred, his Democratic opponent for U.S. Senate, raised $4 million since July. In the same period of time, but also much more extended for Colin Allred, Tallarico outraising him, I think, stands to be one of the first points of interest for the Senate race that seem to suggest the Democrats are on the close pathway to nominating Tallarico in the Texas Senate race for the 2026 election cycle. Seeing these data points come out of the state, it has been very interesting to watch this, not really, that explosive or not necessarily competitive, but not explosive or fiery Democratic primary. But there is absolutely a competitive nature to the 2026 primary in Texas, with Colin Allred as the former Democratic nominee for Senate in this state running again in the 2026 cycle. For a bit of context, Colin Allred ran against Ted Cruz and outpaced Kamala Harris on the statewide level. Kamala Harris lost Texas by 14. Colin Allred lost it by roughly 8.5 points. So an overperformance for sure, but not enough that it came close to Beto O'Rourke's very close, potential victory in 2018 when he came within about 3 percentage points of defeating Ted Cruz across the state in what was expected to be quite a good race for Ted Cruz. Ended up being far more competitive than people realized. But the 2026 cycle seems to be not only here in Texas, but across the board, there seems to be an appetite from Democrats for something new. Voters oftentimes have a right to want to have a new candidate represent them, whether it's on the general election stage or in the Democratic primary stage, and that's what we're starting to see here. Now, Colin Allred was a congressman from Texas's 32nd district. He'd served in office since the 2018 midterm elections, actually, and of course was the nominee in 2024. So his name ID is quite high. Almost every single Democratic household knows his name, knows who he was, and knows what he did. Not the same thing for James Tallarico, but what we are finding is that voters are very much learning about him and really liking him when they do. Thinking about the fact that he's been able to raise $6 million when Allred had 3 months to raise $4 million, I think it's indicative, at least at initial glance, of the energy and enthusiasm that stays on the side of Tallarico. Tallarico has broken a fundraising record in the first quarter of any Senate candidate in Texas history in 3 weeks alone. A quarter of the year is 3 months. Not Beto, not John Cornyn, not Ken Paxton, not Colin Allred. It is James Tallarico who has raised this amount of money. And when you actually put it into perspective, that extended across an entire quarter. Now, not to say that that's exactly, what you can always do, but you absolutely can look at it from the perspective of Roy Cooper. We talked about this just a few days ago about the shattering of the records in any Senate race in U.S. history. Roy Cooper raised $14.5 million, the most that any candidate has made as a challenger in one of their first quarters in U.S. history. Obviously, a lot more money is raised closer to the election, but this early out, Roy Cooper absolutely broke a record in the same way that James Tallarico did. Now, I think that this is also going to be very interesting to see exactly how this plays an impact, not only in the Democratic primary, but also in the general election. We know that this Democratic primary is going to be competitive, but the appetite for Tallarico has gone up significantly, especially when you take a look at some of the data that had been released earlier on. Now, Emerson College didn't field a poll with James Tallarico in the bunch, but they found that in a multi-way race, it is Colin Allred who wins without Tallarico being questioned on the ballot here by a pretty massive amount, 58% of support. But the moment that you introduce Tallarico, his lead goes down quite tremendously. 7 points at the initial glance in August, and now Colin Allred is well on his way to a runoff election against James Tallarico, to which Tallarico could very well be in a very strong position. Now, in a race with a lot of names like Jasmine Crockett and Beto O'Rourke, Tallarico, Beto O'Rourke are tied for second place here, but Colin Allred finds himself falling in a distant fourth place. Surprisingly enough, Jasmine Crockett leads the field, but also to name ID and recognition across the state. She probably has, in comparison to Colin Allred, similar and very high name ID. And Beto O'Rourke obviously even has higher name ID than any of the candidates that we've mentioned thus far. But I do think it is notable that Tallarico has taken a race that, Allred seemingly was in this position and also came into it with that advantage, receiving a number of endorsements from members of Congress already, a few state representatives across the state. But James Tallarico is making that fight and making that case to the voters, and they are very much responding to it. The reception to Tallarico in Texas seems to be very energized and enthusiastic. The only hurdle here for Tallarico is that not all of the voters know who he is. Name ID is a very big thing in a primary, but the good news for Tallarico is that with more money than Colin Allred, you stand to benefit by improving your name ID across the state. 51% of voters say that they don't know enough about him, but of those that do, you are talking an advantage here of 15 percentage points. Now, Allred has an advantage of 9, but 19% of voters don't know enough about him. That's not exactly, the worst place to be, but Tallarico arguably has a lot more room to grow. If 51% of voters in Texas do not know enough about Tallarico to form an opinion, and yet in the Democratic primary, you are finding that Tallarico is within 4 points of victory, that means something. It translates into something that says in a year's time, or in the primary time, in 6 months' time, as more voters learn who James Tallarico is, the more they like him and the more they're willing to vote for him. Let's get down here to the Democratic primary rather than the Republican primary. It is quite interesting because the vote intention here, if we see Tallarico, 24% of these Democratic primary voters do not know enough about Tallarico versus Beto O'Rourke and Colin Allred, 96 and 95% of Democratic primary voters know who they are and have enough formed opinions on them that they're willing to answer the question on favorable versus unfavorable. It is fascinating because it shows that with 1 out of 4 of these Democratic primary voters not knowing who James Tallarico is, he still finds himself in this multi-way race, tied for second against a hypothetical Jasmine Crockett entrance into the Senate race, which she just simply is not going to do. But it also explains exactly why James Tallarico has so much more room to grow, especially when you are outpacing your opponent, especially when you are gaining and climbing in the polls, especially when voters who may not even know who you are willing to back you because they've heard good things and because they know and trust you. And that's the way that primary elections are often won, and that is the way, honestly speaking, that general elections are won too. Now, it shouldn't be lost on this that Texas is going to be an immense hurdle for the Democratic Party no matter who they nominate. Even if Republicans put up Ken Paxton, this race is going to be competitive, but also one the Republicans just have, that 14-point delta that Donald Trump had over Kamala Harris in this state as a built-in margin the Democrats will have to overcome if they want any chance at winning the Senate race in Texas. It's not a guarantee, even under the best of circumstances, that Texas flips because even in 2018, despite it being a very good year for the Democratic Party, it just simply didn't happen. And so thinking about, the way that 2026 could go, absolutely. You could find yourself in a position where Texas is competitive and within reach for the Democrats, assuming the energy and enthusiasm maintains itself, assuming that, you're getting a candidate like Tallarico in the general election. Those are the things that could happen. But it also just happens to be that this is one of the more conservative states in the country that will require a very, very strong Democrat. And I do believe that based off what we've seen thus far, that Tallarico is that guy. He's raised $6 million in the first 3 weeks, in contrast to Colin Howard, who has raised $4 million since July. And just thinking, too, this could very well be a standard case of very high name ID bringing Colin Howard across the finish line right now, but something that ends up trailing off because 58% has quickly turned into 46%, and 50% has quickly turned into 40%. And the leads that were once there have started to find themselves a lot closer and closer to being either a runoff election that Tallarico would stand to benefit from, or an election where Tallarico could get close to winning over 50% of the vote outright. And that will be the interesting part of the 2026 race, and that will be the one that will help Democrats and Republicans, arguably, figure out exactly where their footing is in this Texas Senate race. Because the Republican primary matters too. And we're not going to spend too much time talking about it, but we know that now with the entrance of Wesley Hunt in this race, we are near guaranteed heading to a competitive runoff election, likely between John Cornyn and Wesley Hunt, or John Cornyn and Ken Paxton. We'll see. There's data that seems to suggest it could go either direction, but Ken Paxton is probably going to make it into that runoff election, to which maybe an endorsement from Wesley Hunt or a good relationship with him or the president, whoever it might be, might come out and actually benefit the Ken Paxton in this race here. But this GOP primary is often one of the more important parts of it. But this Democratic primary is one that I do think we're starting to see take shape, and I do think that there is an energy and enthusiasm behind Tallarico, as evident by the numbers and by his crowd sizes and by the engagement that his campaign has seen in just a short period of time. Because these things don't just happen by accident. Tallarico very much is a very strong candidate for this moment, and a lot of Democrats want him in Texas, and it's showing. And whether this race ends up being more or less competitive on the Democratic primary side, no matter what, the general election will still be the uphill battle with Tallarico as the underdog, but absolutely a race worth investing in. Because for the first time in a long time, if the stars align, Texas could very well be that one competitive state the Democrats have tried countlessly and always to no avail, that might end up following through in 2026 just by the sheer nature of the midterm cycle and who the Republicans are likely to put forth in the election. No guarantees on that front, but the Democratic primary thus far absolutely competitive, but also of very much interest for both sides for good reason, because right now as it stands, a competitive race with Tallarico gaining momentum, raising and outraising his opponents, and a race that will be one to watch because it will have implications far beyond just the Democratic primary and also general election, but also on the national stage as we look to future Democratic primaries that could be even more competitive in 2028 and beyond. But the first hurdle here for Tallarico for the Texas Senate race is the Democratic primary, where he's outraising and also outpacing in terms of trajectory here, where it is more likely than not, I believe, that Tallarico will be the Democratic nominee for Senate in Texas and face off against the Republican in the general election. But we will have to wait and see if that pans out to reality by the time the primary rolls around early next year. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.